Hope your week is off to a safe start. You're watching Arirang TV's special coverage of COVID-19. I'm Min San-hee. President Moon Jae-in has called on Korea's medical community to redouble its efforts in finding a cure or vaccine for COVID-19. So how far have we come in terms of finding that elusive vaccine or cure? We'll find out later on in the program when we sit down with our experts. But first, as always, let's take a look at the headlines for this Monday with our Kwon Soa and Noaram. Welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
So I will start with you. Let's look at the figures on the domestic front then.
All right, we started off with 25 new cases this Monday, which means that's almost half of what we saw on last Monday. And even then, back then, we had a significant decrease already. So with that, Korea's total number of confirmed cases this Monday stands at 10,537. 3 people lost their lives over the span of a day, and the gap between people in quarantine and fully recovered has widened with more than 7,400 discharged. Meanwhile, 16 out of the new 25 cases are overseas cases. Now, let's take a look at the daily rise in cases since the outbreak in January. Since mid-March to April, we've been hovering below and above 100. And since last week, cases have stayed well under 100 and around 50 or even lower. Yes.
So I understand the social distancing campaign is set to end on the 19th of April. That's this Sunday. Can we expect to go back to our daily lives after that?
Well, that's probably what many people would like to know right now, as the next task would be to get the economy back on track. That's really hard hit from the coronavirus. But officials have not made a definite decision yet. In fact, Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun said this morning that the government will evaluate the outcomes of the social distancing campaign later this week and discuss whether to ease the measures and how to do so. He stressed, however, that to some extent people will need to practice social distancing for the time being, stressing a hasty return to normal can result in an irreversible outcome. Meanwhile, officials thanked the majority of religious groups for turning to alternatives such as online congregation over Easter weekend, and also noted the strict precautionary measures at thousands of polling stations for early parliamentary voting. And despite the pandemic, or maybe due to the pandemic, voter turnout for early voting hit a record high of almost 26.7%.
That is impressive. Also, around the world, I understand the situation in the UK is worsening, but one piece of good news is that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is out of the hospital.
That's right. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was discharged from London's St. Thomas Hospital on Sunday, and his time there included 3 days in intensive care. So let's hear what he had to say.
I've today left hospital after a week in which the NHS has saved my life, no question. It's hard to find words to express my debt, but before I come to that, I want to thank everyone in the entire UK for the effort and the sacrifice you have made and are making.
Johnson in particular thanked the nurses who have been taking care of him 48 hours, quote, when things could have gone either way. The British leader won't immediately go back to work, according to the Prime Minister's office. The UK, meanwhile, had a somber Easter weekend. Its health secretary told people to stay home as the death toll surpassed 10,000. The UK is now the 5th country in the world to exceed that mark, and according to some predictions, it could become the worst affected country in Europe. In fact, if we take a look at our table here, it has now more than 84,000 total cases. That's more than China and Iran. So we are seeing different trends now. Hopes, meanwhile, are on the horizon in countries like Italy and Spain, as cases are slowing down there. That's not the case in the US yet, which surpassed Italy as the country with the highest death toll, with almost 22,000 over the weekend. And meanwhile, Japan has now more than 8,000 cases, and Russia on Sunday reported its largest daily increase in new cases ever since the outbreak began, at over 2,000 deaths, which really shows there is still potential of dramatic dramatic changes around the world.
All right, so thank you for those figures. Aram, Easter Sunday has passed and Pope Francis gave his usual Easter message, but I understand the scene was quite different this year.
That's right. We are celebrating Easter in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, and the Pope celebrated Easter in an empty St. Peter's Basilica, that is usually crowded with tens of thousands of people at this time of year, but obviously it was empty because of the outbreak. The focus of his message was mainly for the world to come together in the face of the pandemic. Here he was speaking earlier on Easter Sunday.
I encourage political leaders to work actively for the common good of citizens, providing the means and resources needed to enable everyone to lead a dignified life, and when circumstances allow, to assist them in resuming their normal daily activities. This is not a time for indifference, because the whole world is suffering and needs to be united in facing the pandemic.
Yes, he also added that this year's Easter of Solitude should be a contagion of hope, as he put it in his words. He also praised medical staff on the front lines of the pandemic and hailed those working to keep essential services running. Francis expressed sympathy for those not able to bid farewell to their loved ones who passed away because of the virus, because of these movement and gathering restrictions. He also urged for the relaxation of international sanctions, debt relief for poor nations and ceasefires in armed conflicts. Francis expressed particular concern for the future of Europe, saying it was vital that rivalries that existed before World War II, quote, do not regain force as a result of the pandemic. He said those words because some EU nations are at odds over how to help the bloc's economy recover after the pandemic.
I see. Aram, imported cases continue to be a problem here in Korea, and I understand travellers from the US are likely to see tougher measures.
That's right. All arrivals from the United States are to be tested for COVID-19 within 3 days of self-isolation. The stricter measure is in effect as of today. It comes as confirmed cases from the US have been increasing steadily despite a slowdown in domestic cases. Out of all the imported cases so far, almost half of them are from America. Asymptomatic passengers from the US are required to self-isolate at home for 2 weeks. Those who do show symptoms must undergo tests upon arrival. Korea has also been enforcing 2-week quarantine and virus tests for all long-term arrivals from Europe, regardless of symptoms. And there's also tougher measures for all other arrivals from overseas as well.
Now, the mystery surrounding COVID-19 has yet to be unraveled, but I understand we have made yet another breakthrough.
That's right. Scientists from Britain and Germany have reconstructed the evolutionary past of COVID-19. In layman's terms, it's a family tree of the virus as the infection spread from the Chinese city of Wuhan to the rest of the world. Now, this sheds light on the mutations COVID-19 has undergone since its origin, helping to better understand why the virus is so contagious. The researchers say there are 3 distinct variants of COVID-19. They've labeled them as A, B and C, consisting of clusters of closely related lineages. They trace the origins of the pandemic by analysing 160 genomes from human patients. They found that the strain in Wuhan actually mutated from an earlier version, meaning that Wuhan may not have been the origin of the virus. And the research also helped scientists to trace infection routes from one human to the next, and thus have a statistical tool to suppress future infection when the virus tries to return.
I see. Well, that is quite interesting. All right, Aram, thank you for that. So thank you. We'll see you again tomorrow with the updates. We are now poised to join the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters for the regular briefing on COVID-19. This past weekend, Korea recorded 30 new cases on Saturday and 32 cases on Sunday. Out of the 32 new cases on Sunday, 24 were imported cases and 8 were domestic. Authorities are thus emphasizing calls for social distancing as well as self-quarantine after arriving in the country to curb the spread of the virus. The social distancing campaign has been extended to this coming Sunday, and until then, health officials are urging people to abide by containment measures. They've also pointed out that life in the coming months will revolve around continued efforts to ensure personal health. Here now is the briefing.
Let us now begin our regular briefing on the coronavirus outbreak here in South Korea. As of today, the total number of confirmed cases stands at 10,537, and of them, 929 imported cases, and of the total, 7,447 or 70% have been discharged following full recovery. Yesterday, we had 25 more patients, and 79 more people were discharged. So overall, we are seeing a decrease in the number of who are being discharged. And also yesterday, we had 3 fatalities additionally, and I send my deepest condolences to those who have passed away as well as the members of their bereaved families. And the total fatality rate stands at 2.06% as of now, a slight increase from the past. And out of the 25 cases yesterday, 16 were related to the imported cases, and 9 were reported at the cluster infections. And we are currently conducting the epidemiological investigations. And looking at the source of infection during the past 2 weeks, the majority of them were related to the imported cases, and family-related were 7.1%, and hospitals or nursing homes were about 27.3%, and other clusters were about 9.6%. And yesterday, we had, out of the 16 imported cases, 12 came from the Americas, and Europe, there were 4, and the rest were the other regions, including Indonesia. And the regional breakdown of the confirmed cases is as follows. At the Daegu, the second Miju hospital, we also conducted a screening testings on every one of the patients and their families, and 1 additional case have been reported, making the total of about 198. And regarding the Gyeonggi-do Province St. Mary's Hospital in Ujeongbu, we had 3 more confirmed cases, and now making the total to 62. And at the Gyeongbuk Province, Yecheon-gun County, we had also, we are tracing the contacts, and there were 3 more cases confirmed additionally, and we have 14 cases so far. And the KCDC, currently in light of the increase of the infections from overseas, we have seen that 58% of the total cases are related to imported cases. Therefore, we also advise those who are coming in from abroad as well as their families to comply with the self-quarantine measures. We ask the family members to use their own belongings and utensils as well as other items and comply with the self-quarantine measures strictly in order to curb the further spread of the disease. And we also advise you to clean and wipe the surface of the frequently touched surfaces, and we also want you to minimize people-to-people contacts. And as we are seeing a decrease in the number of daily confirmed cases, however, the KCDC believes that we still have risks of big cluster infections, especially among closed-door places. And as we witnessed in the Daegu case, or as witnessed in other countries in Europe, we know that this could lead to a higher fatality rate of high-risk people, as well as a collapse in the public medical system. So therefore, we urge you to comply with the personal hygiene measures. And especially the coronavirus is also very contagious, even at the beginning stages and when a person is asymptomatic. And in order to further spread the virus, we believe that minimizing people-to-people contact is very crucial, and to reduce the contacts among people, and also refraining from going to indoor places which are very crowded. And if you need to go out, you need to wear a face mask, and if you have symptoms, you need to get screened at these screening facilities. This is very important. And the young people have visited the enclosed spaces, including the nightlife venues, cafes, and clubs, but we advise all of them to stop and refrain from going going to these places. And during the weekend, we had Easter celebrations as well as the early votings for the general elections, and we saw an increase of the movements of people. And if this week we could see a possible increase of the patients, and we believe therefore it is very important to identify the patients at an early stage. So if you have any symptoms, do visit the screening centers to get tested, and please cooperate in our measures in identifying patients at an early stage. And during the past week, we are seeing a decrease of the number of patients, and this decrease itself was possible thanks to the measures of enhanced social distancing that have been put in place since 3 weeks ago. And also it was possible thanks to the municipal efforts to track the patients and their contacts. However, we are currently focusing on the size of the new confirmed cases so that it does not lead to any other increase in the asymptomatic patients. And we are currently eyeing on how to identify these asymptomatic patients at an early stage. As we mentioned earlier, we also witnessed a widespread of contacts and physical gatherings during the past weekend, and we believe that this could possibly lead to a surge in the number of patients. And if you have any symptoms like fever or sore throat or cough, please refrain from going to work, but go to the screening centers and get tested. And we also ask doctors and medical experts to have them screened as well. And also some of the media outlets have said and reported that we are seeing a decrease in the number of the confirmed cases because we have a lower number of people who are tested, but we make clear that this is not true. The quarantine authorities are currently carrying out our guidelines and have expanded our target of the screening testings, and therefore we did not arbitrarily decrease the size of these people who are subject to testings, and this is something that we would like to make clear once again. And the quarantine authorities also pay respect to the opinions and the decisions of the medical practitioners. And going back to what we would like to highlight, we also want to highlight the public to participate in enhanced social distancing campaign going forward. Thank you very much.
Right, that was the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters with the latest facts and figures on COVID-19 here in Korea. 25 new cases were recorded as of early Monday, raising our total number of infections to 10,537. Now, this latest figure is a dramatic drop from the peak of 909 cases in February 29th. Meanwhile, the death toll from COVID-19 here currently stands at 217. Monday also marks 85 days since the first case was reported in Korea on January 20th. Meanwhile, the United States is now home to the largest COVID-19 outbreak in the world, with that virus having surpassed cancer and heart attack as the leading cause of death in that country. In this next corner, we connect live with Connie Lee from Washington, D.C. to learn more about the situation there. Hello, Connie.
Hi.
Connie, could you give us a rundown on the latest events in the U.S.?
Right, like you mentioned, the U.S. reached a grim milestone just over the weekend, now recording the most number of deaths from COVID-19 out of any other country. And I believe the death toll right now is over 22,000 people. Now, right now, Americans are trying to be vigilant, social distancing and staying careful, especially in the hardest state of New York and here in Washington, D.C., where it could be the next hotspot. Now, most Americans, around 80%, are under a stay-at-home order, which means you should not be going outside unless you're getting essentials. Now, you see images from my phone here, streets of DC, which is usually bustling and very busy on a weekday, but it's empty. And you see a lot of signs like this and people lining up for the grocery store, which is not normal. And like yourself, I also work in news, so I have to go into work sometimes, but There's no rush hour, no traffic, and for Americans, wearing a face mask is not normal. But right now, the U.S. health officials are recommending people wear face coverings when they do go out. So now you see a lot of Americans actually wearing face masks when they're jogging, when they're out getting food at the grocery store or at the pharmacy.
That is good to know. Connie, is it true that social distancing measures in the U.S. have also led to cases of violence?
Well, there have been recent cases of some violence targeted to Asian Americans, and the FBI actually recently reported that Asian Americans are now experiencing more hate crime than before because of the coronavirus outbreak. You might have heard stories from Texas where a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old were stabbed in front of a grocery store, and the suspect allegedly told police that he stabbed them thinking they were Chinese and they were spreading the disease. Now, we also hear of stories, different Asian Americans getting yelled at, getting racial slurs when they're outside in public, and people making, just the faces or deliberately dodging Asian Americans when they see them. And that's why there was uproar when President Trump was calling this the Chinese virus, because he was basically calling this virus by a people group, which is not correct.
Right. Well, those cases are rather unfortunate. Connie, how is the U.S. media covering the COVID-19 outbreak then? What is the focus of their coverage?
Well, a lot of the focus is on the hospitals right now. A lot of the hospitals are facing medical equipment shortages. A lot of protective gear is not coming in. And so you hear a lot about the hospital staff facing not being able to wear new face masks every day. And there's also an issue of not having enough beds for these patients or not having enough ventilators, which are crucial to treat COVID-19 patients. Now, there's also the issue of testing kits not being readily available, and people are not being tested here in the U.S. And a lot of the comparisons are made between the U.S. and Korea, actually, because Korea was able to test a lot more people per capita than the U.S. has been able to.
Which is why I'm going to ask you, how are Korea's containment efforts being assessed by the public there in the U.S., Connie?
I think in general, a lot of the American media is doing the comparison, but it's hard to compare because the U.S. population is much greater than Korea's population. But the fact that Korea was able to contain the virus in the city of Daegu and also test a lot of the people. Right now, we are not able to test a lot of the Americans here. People will go to the hospital with the symptoms of COVID-19, but will be turned away, and they're being asked to stay at home and to self-quarantine. Whereas in Korea, you hear a lot of the stories where people are getting tested on the streets, and they're able to get the results on their phones right away. And so there is a lot of comparisons made with Korea being kind of set as an example or maybe possibly a model for the U.S. to take after.
All right, Connie, thank you very much for being with us today. That was Connie Lee from Washington, D.C.
치료제와 백신은 코로나19의 완전한 극복을 위해 반드시 넘어야 할 산입니다. 코로나19 백신 개발 등에 2,100억 원을 투자하고 치료제와 백신 산업의 경쟁력을 높일 것입니다.
Pharmaceutical firms across the world are racing against the clock to develop more effective test kits and, in the long run, a vaccine or cure for COVID-19. So just how far or how close are we to that endeavour? For more on that, I have Professor John Fendos from Tongso University. Hello, Professor. And I have Dr. David Kwak from Soonchunhyang University Hospital. Hello, Dr. Kwak.
Good afternoon.
First, we'll start with Professor Fendos. For test kit makers here in Korea, it appears the demand is outpacing production because their order books apparently are full until the end of May. How do you explain this phenomenon?
So I think there are two things that go into it. The first is that there's a lot of confidence in the Korean process and the Korean products that allowed Korea to have containment of the Daegu outbreak. Another issue I think has to do with the lack of competitors. There are not many countries right now that can actually export large amounts of test kits. China is the other one that has been doing it a little, but there, from reports through Spain, we've seen that those test kits aren't always very reliable. So I think from a buyer standpoint, a foreign buyer standpoint, that kind of success record and that kind of reliability and just the fact that there aren't that many other options really plays well into getting these Korean kits to foreign buyers.
And staying with the idea of being reliable, Korean test kits, Dr. Kwak, have been approved by the US FDA for emergency use and they're currently being shipped there. What are your thoughts on this reality?
I believe they are actually following what has worked. As Professor Fendos has mentioned, because Korea showed the world that we are mitigating the spread of the virus very well. All the other countries that have seen us do that very well would follow us to their needs.
Right. Professor Fendos, given Korea's containment efforts of COVID-19 so far, would you place Korea's healthcare response system on a higher global standing?
I think you have to, especially when it comes to the supply issue. There are usually two things that go into that. The first one has to do with, do you have a stockpile or not? And Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, these locations had pretty large, substantial stockpiles of medical supplies in advance of the epidemic, which is why they were able to respond to it very quickly. A lot of countries like Italy, Spain didn't, and in the United States, in theory, did, but because of lack of funding, lack of oversight, and other concerns, oftentimes the equipment was actually not ready for use or poorly maintained. Another thing that goes into it as well also has to do with the issue of, I'm sorry.
The issue of?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pass it over.
We could, I'm sure, fine. We were talking about whether you would place Korea on a higher global standing with regard to its response to the COVID-19 so far. Dr. Kwak, what are your thoughts on that?
I would absolutely say yes to that.
Okay.
Because its numbers are telling, pretty much. We are on a very fast-paced decrease in the numbers, and I think those are quite meaningful. It shows clearly that we were able to mitigate the spread of the virus, and we are very managing well in the containment of the virus. So as long as we keep on fighting like this, I think we would show the world the great results again.
Right. Now, amid a flood of requests for test kits and other medical supplies, Korea has selected 4 nations as priority regions. These include the US, the UAE, Indonesia, and Romania. Now, the latter country is fondly remembered here for closing off a dam to aid rescue operations in neighboring Hungary when a passenger ship carrying dozens of Korean tourists sank in the Danube River last May. We have details about the situation in Romania in this next report.
안녕하세요. 네, 저는 루마니아에서 현재 공부를 하고 있는 만 22살 김은희입니다.
네, 저는 루마니아에 살고 있는 만 22살 미하이 킴이라고 합니다.
국가 비상사태의 기간을 5월 16일까지로 연장시켰습니다. 이에 따라 현재 통행 제한, 외출 금지령, 휴교령과 같은 시행령을 지켜야 하는 그 기간도 같이 늘어났습니다. 필수적인 목적 외로는 외출을 금지시키고 있고요. 외출을 할 시에는 자가신고서라는 서류를 필수적으로 작성하고 지참해야 합니다. 외출을 할 때마다 갱신해서 작성을 해야 하고요. 이를 작성하지도 않고 지참하지도 않다가 불시에 검문을 당해서 적발될 경우에는 최소 2,000레인, 즉 하나로 약 55만 원의 벌금을 부과하게끔 되어 있습니다.
지금 여기는 크고 작은 회사들이 모여 있고 또 주택들이 모여 있는 길가인데요. 사람들이 대부분 마스크를 착용하고 있고요. 대중교통보다는 자가용을 이용하시는 분들이 많은 것 같습니다. 지금 여기 마트 들어가기 전에 손 씻고 소독하게끔 이런 시설도 배치해 놨습니다. 많이 비어 있을 줄 알았는데요. 물건들이 꽤 채워져 있는 것 같아요. 처음에는 사재기 현상이 많았는데 지금은 괜찮은 것 같습니다.
그 뉴스 보도나 아니면 SNS상의 국민들 여론 반응을 좀 지켜봤는데요. 출처는 주 루마니아 대한민국 대사관 페이스북 홈페이지가 있습니다. Thank you very much, South Korea. God bless all of you. 이렇게 한글로 감사합니다 한국이라고 얘기해 주시는 분도 계셨네요. 태극기도 휘날리고 있네요. 그리고 두 번째로는 루마니아 정부 대처에 대한 반응인데 오늘 참 무능하다. 다른 나라에서 진단 그 키트를 가져오다니 루마니아 인구가 2천만 명인데 그에 비해서 이 진단 키트의 수는 너무 적다. 터무니없다라는 뜻이고요. 어쨌든 한국에서 들여온 것에 대해서 루마니아 사람들이 고마워하고 있는 반응입니다. 오늘은 이렇게 루마니아 현지 상황에 대해서 말씀을 드렸는데 어찌되었든 하루빨리 코로나 바이러스가 종식하고 우리가 누려왔던 평범하고 행복했던 일상들이 하루빨리 돌아오기를 간절히 소망합니다.
Right, we're back here in the studio with Dr. Kwak and Professor Fendos, who earlier had a mild case of discomfort, but he's feeling much better right now, right?
Thank you.
Professor Fendos, right. We'll start again then with Dr. Kwak. Now, here in Korea, we have a relatively low mortality rate in light of COVID-19. Would you link this to our rigorous testing and early diagnosis?
I would link that definitely to the vigorous movement that we're taking, but there are probably other factors that are working into this as well. So recently a study suggested a possibility that the countries that are giving BCG vaccinations were showing much less in mortality and severity. And also with that, Korea also was very quick to implement what's called the triage facilities, one of those container boxes that we usually see on the news. And there, in front of the hospitals, it gives hospitals the ability to sort of discern patients and put them where they're supposed to be, whether they would be COVID-19 patients or whether they were not. So it gives them the ability to be protected, in a sense, better against the virus from coming into the hospital. And also the fact that we have been vigorously tracing and tracking COVID-19 patients and also physically isolating them from those who are not infected were, I would say, quite effective in the mitigation of the virus. So all of these probably took their part in minimizing the mortality rate here.
Oh, I see. Now, Dr. Kwak talked about using BCG vaccines against COVID-19 patients. How else, Professor Fendos, are these patients treated once they're inside the hospital?
Right, so the main thing has to do with supportive treatment. So the main cause of death usually is difficulty in breathing, lack of oxygen in the blood. And so ventilators are the main way that you try to support these patients. And as other reports have shown, the number of ventilators usually isn't enough to meet the demand. So you'll see a lot of clips out of the US where you have maybe 4, 6, or 8 patients hooked up to one ventilator at the same time. In addition to that, obviously, there are a lot of experimental drugs that are being tried out and tested out, but we're in pretty early phases of those things so far.
Dr. Kwak, is it true that some people are even purchasing parasitic drugs to treat COVID-19 symptoms?
That just made on the news, and I was quite appalled by it because the anti-parasitic medication that have been reported just recently has only been done in a lab setting. What that means is that it has never been tested in clinical setting, and it hasn't been proved for people in the public to actually go ahead and use them for such purposes. And that being said, there is no proof that the medication would actually work against the COVID virus in our current clinical setting. There have been numerous other medications that have been proved actually in the lab setting to work against the virus. There were medications that actually completely blocked out the virus in the lab setting, but later on they were studied so that they would actually not work in a clinical setting. So, and also with these medications, a medication would always certainly bring some sort of side effects, and we have to worry about that as well. So what I would say about these medications is that we need to be extra careful in taking what's on the news. We should always follow doctors' directions before taking medications.
I see. And regardless of the lack of information, people are perhaps purchasing them because of the fear factor then?
I would think so, but I would strongly advise against doing so.
Of course. Staying with these treatments, Professor Fenders, what can you tell us about other alternative remedies? For example, using the anti-HIV drug or the anti-malaria medication. What are your thoughts on those?
So early on, the anti-HIV drugs, which are essentially antiviral drugs, those were kind of the ones that were most hopeful because they do target viruses kind of directly. So far, we've been disappointed that most of the HIV-related drugs haven't seemed to work out. This week, we've had some hope. So there are scores of different types of antiviral drugs that are being tested. But as Dr. Kwok correctly points out, a lot of these hints and hopes usually come from these kinds of lab settings where you're testing the drug on cells, not on actual patients. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to confirm that, in fact, those results you get in the lab, you can also get in patients. When it comes to the anti-malaria one, well, there are a couple, but the main one is hydroxychloroquine, which, President Trump touted as the big game changer. It looks like the initial result, which came out of France, they were a little bit perhaps dishonest in only showing the good stuff. And we now know through both the French government and the original researchers and corroborating evidence from the US that hydroxychloroquine unfortunately seems to be associated with some pretty serious heart-related side effects. So that one's probably off the table now.
I see. Dr. Kwok, Korean researchers have used blood plasma from recovered patients to successfully treat COVID-19 patients themselves. Could you tell us a bit more about the blood plasma remedy?
Oh, sure. So this is not an idea that's brand new. It's what's called a convalescent transfusion therapy. It's done by extracting blood from a recovered patient, extracting the serum part of the blood and transfusing that serum part into the patient who is currently fighting the virus. Now, in this serum, which is the fluid part of the whole blood, includes a certain materials and what's more importantly called antibodies. Antibodies are sort of like machine warriors that has mechanisms to remember how they fought against certain virus inside the serum. So if that is to be transfused into another person, they will remember how to fight against the virus. And that's probably what happened with the two patients that we had in the very prestigious Korean hospital. But with it also, are some factors that we need to be careful for. Because we're transfusing a person's blood component, it can certainly carry with it a certain other material, such as viruses. And also because it is carrying a foreign material with it, it can cause an allergic reaction inside a new person's body. So those are some major things that we need to look out for, and those would probably factor into making decisions for possibly treating other patients with convalescent plasma therapy in the future.
And surely because of these drawbacks then, Professor Fenders, it would be difficult to produce it on a mass scale.
Well, I guess it depends what kind of scale you would like. So Professor Kwok can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the maximum amount of plasma usually people can give is about 800 mils to about a liter. And most of the things that I've been looking at seem to suggest that the treatments they've been using are about 200 to 300 liters. So that means that one full donor can treat about 3 to 5 people, which isn't bad, especially in Korea where you have about 7,300 people who are confirmed cases now fully recovered. If every single one of those gave a maximum dose, you would have, in theory, enough treatments for over 20,000 people. Now, obviously, that wouldn't help the United States because you have on the order of 500,000 now confirmed cases. But I think, especially for internal use, for domestic use for Koreans, I think collecting that kind of plasma probably would be very helpful.
Dr. Kwok, how long does it take for one person to give the maximum, is it plasma?
That'll be done usually within a couple of hours, few hours.
Oh, it's not that long then?
Yes, it doesn't just come out of a person within a matter of seconds. So yes, but we also have to think about how we are going to get the donations from people. It has to be donations because there would be ethical issues involved. But also at the same time, we have to screen all of them out, whether they would have other possible viruses carrying with them. So those are the things that we have to take into considerations.
And Dr. Kwok, government officials here in Korea have said that the COVID-19 pandemic would come to an end when 60% of the population here becomes immune to the virus. It's also known as herd immunity. What are your thoughts on this?
I am very hopeful for that. So as you mentioned, it is what's called a herd immunity, and it has shown in the history that has to work out for the global population. So it is basically a phenomenon when there is enough people who are immune against certain virus, usually through vaccinations, but at this time I guess it's through exposure, then sort of the people who are infected would work as a buffer between who are not infected and those who are infected. So they would discontinue the transfer of the virus from one person to another. And for this COVID-19 virus, probably judging from the R factor, that is how many a person can infect others, they probably calculated the 60% of number from there. It has also shown in the history in cases like smallpox. That's how I can't say they got eliminated, but so eventually, when it takes certain time for everyone to get immune, let's say 60% of the population, eventually the virus would be eliminated from the earth, hopefully.
Oh, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
But then where does, Professor Fenders, in your opinion, where does the idea of, because we have had cases here in Korea where patients who were fully recovered found themselves reinfected with the virus, and authorities claimed it was not necessarily a reinfection from outside, but maybe a reactivation of the virus inside the body. What are your thoughts on that?
Right, so it's still unclear exactly what's going on with that. I mean, we even have cases where the virus seems to show up in animals now. So there was that tiger in the New York City Zoo that showed up, also these reports of pets. So definitely there seems to be some mutation of the virus, so that would negatively affect the body's ability to fight it off, because your body becomes acclimated to one version, but then if it mutates and becomes a second version, there are instances for other kinds of viruses where you have to fight it again. So it's still unclear exactly what's going on, but there does seem to be room for this type of second introduction of a variant or something that's related but slightly different.
Professor Fenders, as an academic, do you believe that there is a pressing need for deregulation with regard to coming up with a treatment or vaccine for COVID-19?
Right. So one of the questions I get pretty often lately is, test kits. The passage of test kit regulations was actually pretty quick, but why can't we do the same thing for treatments? And as Dr. Kwok mentioned earlier, one of the issues has to do with safety, because test kits are inherently not very dangerous, right? If someone swabs the inside of your mouth, takes a drop of your blood, you're not going to die from that, you're not going to get sick from that. But when it comes to treatments, as Dr. Kwok said, most treatments, all treatments really, have some kind of side effect. And so, if you're taking a drug, there are going to be other things that the drug is going to do, perhaps affecting the liver in a very small way or affecting other organs in a very small way. And so when you're trying to figure out whether these drugs, what kind of side effects they have, there's a lot of work that needs to go into figuring out what those are. And so a lot of the experiments that we see being reported lately usually are very small sample sizes with restricted numbers of patients. They're also usually not random. So in an ideal situation, you take a bunch of patients, usually a large population if you can, a couple hundred, and randomly distribute them into two groups. One group that gets the treatment, another that doesn't get the treatment, and try to compare the results. But a lot of these treatments that are currently being tested, the doctors, not only do they want to test these things experimentally, but they also have to be fighting on the front lines to save people. So there's often a lot of pressure in both directions, and it's difficult to do those kind of really good experiments to show that they're safe and also that they work.
Professor Kwok, this is a question I ask you because you are a medical expert in the industry right now. What could Korea do with its G20 partners, perhaps, to pull resources together, to collectively work to coordinate a maybe global response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, so I'm going to state this as from out of my head. So this would be rather a personal statement that I'm going to make here. So they should probably come up with an idea to come up with finances for different causes, because that'll be the easiest thing for other countries to do together. So they should probably put together a fund for vaccine and drugs development and also their distribution. But also they should probably form a pact saying that when there is a cure to be found, that they should share it across borders without any politics involved. They should probably also come together to support poorer countries, because obviously those are the countries that are fighting against the virus with much dire, catastrophic consequences. So G20 countries should come together to somehow fund those poor countries as well. But lastly, we also need to start thinking ahead and think about what will come next. The global economy seems to be showing a great dive already, and the unemployment rate for the markets is skyrocketing. We can already see. So they should hopefully come up with a strategy to hasten economic recovery as they can.
Right. So we need financial support. We also need health support, of course. Thank you very much, Dr. Kwok, for your thoughts, and Professor Fendos, again, thank you very much for being with us today. Well, that ends our coverage for this edition of COVID-19. Be sure to join us again tomorrow at the SAR. In Tuesday's coverage, we take a look at how fear over COVID-19 has been fueling xenophobia and racism across the globe. In the meantime, do share your thoughts and inquiries with us through our social media accounts or our homepage, arirang.com. Thank you for being with us.